Well, hey guys, like Joanne said, we are in this last week of More Than Magic, and I'm honored to be able to join you. What we have kind of been looking at through this series is kind of the why did Jesus perform miracles, like kind of asking that question, because I think growing up especially, like I kind of always thought this was like God just kind of doing like a God flex, right? Like, hey, look at all the powers I got, these are all the things I can do, and kind of thought it was more just him showing off. And I think when we actually look at it, it's so much more than that. In fact, one of the things that we've kind of looked at the last 2 weeks is that these miracles are actually signs, right? They're kind of revealing something to us. They're kind of pointing to something else. And so last week, Joel said 3 things about these signs, these miracles that they can teach us. The first one is simply this. A sign is not the point, but it points to Jesus, right? It's not just the thing. The miracle isn't the thing, but instead it's actually showing you something about Jesus. It's showing you some of his character. And the second thing we said is that a sign points to what the kingdom of God looks like, kind of the way that God's kingdom is ran, the way his people act. It's kind of showing you this bigger picture of what God is doing in the world. And then the third thing that we learned is that a sign points to our need for Jesus. These miracles show us different aspects of our lives that we need Jesus in. And so we're going to be looking at a different miracle this morning. And as we do, I kind of want to start with this question, asking something as simple as, have you ever been known for something? Or maybe you've been labeled as something, or maybe you've kind of found your identity in something. I think all of us have at different points in our lives. I'm going to share with you, I would say this is definitely probably the most embarrassing thing in my life. In my entire life, I'm going to share it to you. This is how we're getting intimate. We're getting close in here today, because this is not something I normally tell people about. It's kind of this is not a humble brag. This is not something I'm bragging about. So when I was younger, my dad is a Marine, so we used to move around every 3 years. And I remember 6th grade, we finally moved. We actually moved to West Middleton, and I went to Western Middle School. I remember, did I just get a boo for Western Middle School? Sorry, Kokomo fans. So I was attending there, and I remember how uncomfortable I felt walking into. I remember every time I was a new kid at a new school, it was always the one thing I dreaded the most was the lunchroom. And I've been told now, like, there's a lot of, like, assigned seating, so it doesn't happen as much. But I remember how much I hated walking in the doors of a new school, having to you're literally, like, there's all these different groups, all these different people hanging out, and you just have to be like, hi, I'm just going to sit it with your friends and now act like I'm your friend now. No, it is so uncomfortable. I hated every moment of it. And that first week, I literally just kept going from different table each time, and I didn't say a word. Because I felt too awkward. I didn't know what to do. And then finally, about week 2, 3, I finally get into this rhythm. I found this group of guys I'm sitting with, still not saying a single thing, but I'm at least like, you know what, I kind of enjoy the conversation that we're having here, right? And then one of the kids, I don't even remember what he was eating, but he had peanut butter on one of the things that he had, and I just said, I love peanut butter. And like that was like my grand opening statement to like get introduced to this new friend group. And like all of them kind of like whipped over like, hey, the guy, he finally talked. New kid finally talked. And like instantly, before the end of that lunch, they were calling me Peanut Butter Boy. And like it just kind of sucked because like I started going like, well, I don't just love peanut butter. Like I love it on peanut butter and jelly. I love peanut butter and mustard. I love peanut butter on worms. And like just making up all these things. I had never had any of those things, for the record. That sounds disgusting. But like literally just going off on just random, they'd be like, hey, would you eat it with like this? Would you eat it on that? What about a booger? And I'm like, yeah, of course I would, man. If it's peanut butter covered, I'm in. And like I would, no matter what, I was just saying it to the point where like very quickly, like all of the teachers started just going, oh, that's Peanut Butter Boy. Like they didn't know my name. Even roster, like roll call, be like, Peanut Butter Boy, are you here today? Yes. Like my yearbook is filled. People would start, like one kid said like, hey, I have this jar of peanut butter for you. So then like, of course, I'm just going to take the peanut butter because, I still do like peanut butter. And I put it up in my locker, but then it just emphasizes that people walk by and go, yeah, Peanut Butter Boy's even got peanut butter in his locker. And he like eats it between each class. And so then more people bring you peanut butter. So soon you got like a whole locker of peanut butter. And it's like, I didn't buy any of these. It's just a weird joke that just kept perpetuating, right? And like the first week, I'm gonna be honest, like I probably kind of enjoyed it. Like I was kind of like, yeah, people know who I am. I'm Peanut Butter Boy. Probably kind of puffed out my chest a little bit. Very quickly, as you can imagine, that name does not last very long for being a cool name. And unfortunately, because I had that label for so long, it literally went into like 8th grade, people were still calling me Peanut Butter Boy. And then finally in high school, I finally felt like I started to shake it and people would bring it up, remember you're Peanut Butter Boy? And I was like, yeah, not funny, man. But like I had this label for so long, and some of us, hopefully nobody had the Peanut Butter Boy label, but like we all have different labels on our lives, right? Whether for some of us they're really good ones, right? Ones that you really like. Maybe it's like mom, dad, brother, sister, husband, wife, aunt, uncle. Maybe you're like the crazy uncle. Maybe you're the fun uncle. Maybe you're the uncle they're like, I don't know if he's going to hang out with the kids too much by himself. But wherever you are at, like we all have like these labels that some of us, for the most part, really like those labels. Or maybe it's like an achievement, right? Maybe it's like that thing that you worked really hard for, manager, fill in the blank, whatever it is, and that's like your label, and you were like really proud of it. Or maybe it's even like a thing that you do, right? Or like a hobby. Like some of you, you're like, yeah, like I'm a runner, or like I'm a gardener. I garden things. I think that's what you do as a gardener. Or like one of my favorite things that I think about every time when I think about labels is that there's a whole group of people who are called bronies. If you don't know what this is, these are grown adult men who really love My Little Pony, which is a very small kid show. And they're just like, you know what? We're loud and proud and we love this show. So there's wherever your label is, whether you're proud of it or not, we have some good labels, right? Like we like those good labels. But as you probably already know where I'm going with this, there's also plenty of labels on our lives that we wouldn't be bragging about anytime soon, right? There are labels that we have in our lives that maybe you've never actually called yourself this, but you think it. Or maybe no one else has ever said this about you. Maybe they have. Or maybe this is just one that you've kind of self-imposed on yourself because of maybe some of the pain, maybe some of the hurt that you've experienced, and now you feel like you're kind of broken or you've been rejected and you can't quite be who you were before. Now you're wearing this label, right? Maybe it was something that someone did to you that you just didn't know how to handle. You still haven't really been able to figure out, like, it doesn't seem fair that because of something they did that now you have this label. Or maybe it's even something as simple as something you didn't see coming, right? Like you had like these big grand plans and you never saw that this was going to be a part of it. And now it's kind of labeling you. It's giving you this identity and you never asked for it. Well, the story that we're going to look at today is a guy who's in that similar situation. He has this label. He's been identified by this thing that he wouldn't pick, that he didn't choose. But Jesus is going to kind of completely change and shape his story. So we're going to look at that. We're actually going to be looking at the book of John. This is basically a book that kind of just shows us a picture of the life of Jesus, different things that happened in his life. And we're going to jump right in to John chapter 5. This is what it says. It says, after this, there was a Jewish festival, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So, just a couple small things on this. It says he went up to Jerusalem. No matter if they were east, west, north, south, wherever you were, you always went up to Jerusalem because it was actually a city on a hill. So it was kind of like this big deal where like you were always going to be going up to Jerusalem. And then especially Jews at the time, they would have actually made 3 pilgrimages a year to Jerusalem for like different big holiday events. We don't know exactly which one this one was, but we know there's 3 different holidays. Pick one. They were probably going there for that. And can I just say, like, this is one of those times I'm really glad we have technology. Because it's kind of like, you know, when you go like Christmas or Thanksgiving, you have to like do your big family road trip. But we get like vans with like TVs so like the kids don't have to keep talking the whole way. No, they are straight up stuck on donkeys the whole way. Well, are we there yet? Are we there yet? No. Glad we got vans. So let's continue. It says, in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate in the north city wall is a pool with the Aramaic name Bethesda. It had 5 covered porches. So there is this thing. Let me throw it up. They've actually found where they think like this location is. Go ahead, throw it up there. There we go. Yeah, they think this is probably about the area that they're talking about in this passage. And what's really important is it says it was near Sheep Gate. And Sheep Gate is kind of this important place for us to kind of understand what's really happening here, especially on the day that we're talking about. So during this time, the Passover lambs that people would have been using to celebrate would have only come through Sheep Gate. It's like, there's 4 different sides of the city. This is the Sheep Gate where all the sheep are going to enter. So for Jewish history, kind of Jewish history 101, one of the big moments in the Jewish story in their history is that that God saved them from being, slaves in Egypt, right? He had this big moment where they sacrificed a sheep, put the blood around their doorposts, and then God passed over their houses, freed them from slavery, right? So to kind of make sure like they forever remembered this incredible moment, every year during the Passover festival, they would, again, kill a sheep, they would eat it, and it would kind of be like this reminder that God showed up in the past, he's going to show up in the future. So when you're showing up, the sheep that you were going to have was going to go through this gate. It's kind of all the sheep. This was like the big sacrifice gate. This is where they're going to come through. And because it's Palm Sunday, the Sunday before Easter, this is actually the time that a lot of scholars think when Jesus entered into the Jerusalem on the last week of his life, they also think he entered through Sheep Gate, which would have been a really weird place to come through, but it would have been him kind of showing like, hey, I'm going to be the sacrifice. I'm going to be the sheep. I'm going to be the final Passover. So kind of just fun little fun side facts for you. But let's continue into the passage. It said it had 5 colored porches, and a crowd of people who were sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed sat there. So why are all these people gathered up around this pool? That's kind of weird, right? Well, during this time, there was this big superstition that was going around that this pool would heal you. Would kind of heal you from your sickness, disease, whatever it was. If you got in this pool kind of right after it bubbled, there was this belief that there maybe an angels came down or some sort of angelic thing was happening, where like when the pool kind of bubbled, you knew first one in, guess what? You are going to be healed of whatever you had. And you can imagine that if you have something like that's kind of life-changing as being blind or lame, paralyzed, sick, like you might be like Michael Scott, right? You might be like, I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious. I'm going to give it a try, right? Like you're just going to try it just in case. It's probably not going to work, but you know what? Let's try. And so during this time, like scholars think actually what it probably was is maybe there was a spring underneath the pool that was kind of bubbling the water, or other people think maybe it was kind of like the water system that was running through the city that sometimes, depending on where things were moving, water kind of just bubbled up. But whatever the reason, this is why they're all gathered here. They have this superstition that maybe that something is going to be healed if they put themselves, if they're the first one in the water when it moves. And what is really important about this is because during this time, you kind of just learned the family trade, right? Like if your dad was a blacksmith, guess what you're going to be? You're going to be a blacksmith. If your dad was a carpenter, guess what? You get to now be the new carpenter. Unless you had one of these ailments. If you were sick, blind, lame, paralyzed, if you had one of these things, you kind of got excluded from getting the family thing. Instead, they thought the most kind thing that they could do to you is let you be a beggar and kind of make money that way, right? To kind of just keep asking people for money that people would see you, they would feel bad for you and go, oh, here, please, let me give you some of this. So that was kind of what a lot of these people, they didn't have any other way to make money. This was the one way that they were going to make money. So can you just with me for a moment, just imagine this scene. Close your eyes if you have to. Like there is this pool, there's all these people begging, and they're probably even doing they're kind of begging for money, but they're also kind of looking back the whole time, waiting to see that water move, to see if this is their moment. That this is what, and can you imagine just how uncomfortable you would feel being by this area? I'm sure most people in this room feel the same way. Like sometimes when you're driving and you see someone on the side of the road asking for money, even if I'm not actually having to hear their voice, there's something about us that kind of feels like almost a little bit of shame or embarrassment, or we kind of feel awkward about it, and we're like, we're not going to look that way. And can you imagine a whole crowd of people asking for money? Like if I have to imagine that so often, so many people would even try to just avoid even walking down this area because it just feels so uncomfortable. And I think for so many of them, you have to imagine that they would probably feel left out on what God was doing during this time, right? Maybe you're here and you're like, you know what? That's how I feel today. Like maybe you're here and you feel left out because maybe like your girlfriend, your spouse, whoever it is, dragged you here, and you're like, I don't really want to be here, but I'm here because they're making me, and you kind of feel like you're on the outside of even this group right now. Or maybe you're here and you show up every single week, and you think that there is something special that God is doing through the people like maybe on the stage or the people who are serving, and you're like, yeah, but that's them. That's not me. And you maybe feel like you are on the outside of what God is doing. And I'm here to tell you that if that's how you feel, I hope you know that just like this is still a place for people like that, this is also a place for you. This is a place that you can belong, that God can still use you, and He will not leave you out of what He is doing. So these people have been labeled by something that they couldn't control, and something clearly by where they're sitting they wanted to change about themselves, right? And so let's continue in the rest of this passage. It says, a certain man who had been there sick for 38 years, 38 years, that's a long amount of time. When Jesus saw him lying there, knowing that he had already been there a long time, and he asked him, do you want to get well? And I'll be honest, when I first read this, I kind of was a little embarrassed about this question. Like, to me, when I think about Jesus, like, one of the things I think I maybe love the most about Jesus is, like, the way that he has dialogue and conversations with people. So many people come up to him with all these, like, these big questions, or, like, sometimes they're even trying to trick him. And instead of just giving them, like, an answer, and sometimes he does, but more often it looks like he kind of just gives them, like, a question. And then, like, when they wrestle with that question, right, then they kind of feel like, oh, either there's more to this than I thought, or, like, maybe there's a different answer than, I would have ever thought of on my own if you would have just told me the answer. And so I think Jesus is kind of like this ultimate question asker, and then he asks what feels like a really dumb question, right? Like, I can't even imagine going into, like, a hospital with someone who's been sick for a long time and saying, hey, do you want to get well? Right? Like, it feels embarrassing. I wouldn't even do that, like, even as a joke. It almost feels like a little kid kind of question, right? Like, little kids have literally no filter. And, like, so many times they'll be like, have you been bald your whole life? Or, like, hey, why is your stomach so big? Or like, high schoolers, middle schoolers, they will roast you over nothing. I wear this black shirt a lot, and they'll be like, you literally wear that same black shirt, like, every day. That's so lame, bro. And I'm like, all right, that's not even a question. But, like, it feels like that level of a question, right? It almost feels embarrassing. But I think when we really get down to it, what Jesus is saying is so much deeper than maybe we see at first blush. Instead, I think what he's really getting at, and I think this is true for all of us, that sometimes being sick is easier than doing the work to get better. Sometimes it is so much easier to just stick with what you have been doing than to do the work that actually takes to get better, right? And, like, this is true for big and small things. Like, small things, like, maybe you're here and, like, you're like, you know what, I've been out of shape. Been telling myself for years, I got to start working out more. I got to start doing whatever more. And then you just don't do it, right? I've been there so many times because I'm just like, well, you know what? I kind of like just sitting in the chair. Sounds way more fun than going on a run or doing a workout or I'd rather eat a donut rather than a banana, or, whatever it looks like. Or maybe, like, you've been in this season where, like, your job, it's like you just feel like every single day is exhausting and it beats you down. And maybe instead of actually, like, doing something about it, trying to talk to your manager, or maybe even looking for a new job, instead you're like, you know what, I'm just going to go home. I'm just going to watch Netflix. Going to kind of just binge watch shows, kind of scroll on social media till, like, midnight, 1 o'clock, till, like, my body is literally just falling asleep, and I'm going to do the whole thing tomorrow. That's the way you've learned to cope. Or maybe it's even just as simple as, like, that one thing that person said years ago, maybe months ago, and you keep just replaying it over in your mind, and you've never even talked to them about it. You've never told them how it made you feel, and instead you kind of just let it keep going because it's easier sometimes to just be sick than to do the work to get better, right? Or sometimes it's bigger things. Sometimes we do this with, like, we stay sick and, like, maybe things that happened to us in our past, like traumas that have happened to us, things that you didn't choose. Or maybe it's like a relationship issue, right? Sometimes we do this with, like, a relationship that we're in and we just don't want to fix it, and it just feels easier to just sit there and just kind of keep letting it drag on because we know if we have that conversation, if we bring up that topic, all of a sudden it's going to be a long time before it really gets resolved. Or sometimes maybe it's like a family member who hurt you, or maybe a family member who rejected you. And all of a sudden now you're wearing like this label, this name tag of being rejected, that this is the sickness that you're living in, and you'd rather just sit in that rather than do the work, right? All of a sudden this question doesn't seem so dumb anymore, right? Because Jesus is talking to this guy. His pain had become his identity, right? So many people knew him as just the guy who was a beggar, this guy who was sick. And so often this can be our story too, where we have these things that we stay in. We just stay in that sickness. Jesus reaches down and says, hey, do you want to live in this, or do you want freedom? That's what happens next. It says, the sick man, and notice already the label that has been put on him, the sick man answered him, sir, I don't have anyone who can put me in the water when it's stirred up. When I'm trying to get to it, someone else has already gotten in ahead of me. And I think there's a couple of things to make note in this passage I think is really interesting. The first thing is he hits him with a sir, right? He doesn't hit him with like Jesus. Like there's a good chance that he maybe doesn't even know who he's really talking to. Like maybe he knows it was Jesus, but maybe because of just his life and having to be a beggar and kind of being on the outside of what God's doing, maybe he has no clue who's even talking to him. He just thinks it's some random person, some random man walking up and talking to him. He says, sir, I don't have anyone to put me in the water. And I think when I was growing up, and most of the time when I hear this passage, it always kind of gets turned into this guy kind of coming up with an excuse, right? Like, oh, he's just coming up with an excuse. Like, he won't help himself. Like, sir, I don't have anyone to put me in the water when it's stirred up. Like, he's just literally not trying. He doesn't want to help himself. And then this week, as I was looking at this passage, I've actually heard a different way to kind of understand this that I think, at least for me, kind of connects a lot more, especially if he doesn't know that this is Jesus. Like, there's a good chance that maybe he's just kind of saying, like, his rehearsed answer, right? Like, he's been asked this so many times. He's been here for 38 years by this pool. And there's probably a good chance that people have asked him before, like, why are you here? Why are you sitting here? Kids walking up down the street. Hey, why are you here, man? You know, all those things. And instead of this being him making an excuse, maybe he's just going through I don't have anyone who can put me in the water when it's stirred up. When I'm trying to get to it, someone else has gotten in ahead of me. Like, kind of just going through, like, his rehearse, like, this is what I say to everyone kind of speech. But then Jesus kind of does this life-changing moment. Let's check it out. It says, Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. Immediately, the man, you notice, all of a sudden, he's not the sick man. All of a sudden, his label has already been changed. The man was well, and he picked up his mat and walked. What I love about this, what I think is so good, is that this isn't a miracle that Jesus just does and, like, it just instantly heals everything, right? Like, this guy has to participate in it. He has to get up, pick up his mat, and walk. There's 3 different things that he is joining in that Jesus has asked him to do. And for me, at least, whenever I hear this, I always think, like, what if he didn't get up? Right? Like, what if he would have just stayed down? What if he's just like, yeah, you're just trying to make fun of me. You're just trying to make fun of, like, the way that I am right now. You're just trying to make it so everyone else laughs at me right now. What if he didn't believe what Jesus was asking him to do? But instead, he has this life-changing moment that this man was getting to join in on what God was doing in the world. He got to join in on his own healing. And I think if we're honest, most of the time miracles are more like this than the way that we think of it. I think a lot of times we traditionally think of like a miracle or like something that God's doing as like God's going to show up, do some amazing thing, and then we're going to be like, yes, God, you're amazing, praise God, and for sure, like that happens sometimes, right? But I think more often than not, at least in my life, and I get if we would probably have time to share, like a lot of you would feel the same way. Like most of the time, the miracles I see God doing are actually me joining in, participating in what he is doing in the world. Like when I see life change in myself and other people, I normally see like other people joining in on what God is doing. One of the ways that I feel like this is probably the most obvious way for this to show up is like when someone is dealing with like loneliness or pain or loss, or maybe they're grieving something. Like it feels really shallow to me to just go, I'm praying for you, and like kind of just move on, right? Like especially if it's somebody like maybe if it's someone you don't know and you don't don't know that well, maybe that's the correct response. But like if it's someone that you care about, if it's someone that you love, like you don't just say that, right? Like you go and join in with them in that grieving, right? Like you go and like spend time with them to help them get over their loneliness. And sometimes it can be super mundane things, right? Like sometimes it's going to see a movie, sometimes it's playing a board game together. That doesn't feel like this big, huge spiritual thing, but in the moment, you are actually partnering with what God is doing in their lives to help them through that. You are joining in on the miracle that God is doing in their lives. And then this passage, I would be remiss if I didn't say this, because I think this is maybe the coolest part of the story, is that like this guy who's literally, he's on this mat, right? This thing that has identified him for this long. This old thing that was used to kind of give him his identity, to define him, he ends up getting to stand up in his new identity and literally picks up his old identity, right? He picks up his mat and walks. Like in my mind, like he's literally like, he's holding it over his head, like he's being like Rocky after he finished doing the big run up the stairs. Like he is so excited. Can you imagine this moment? This man literally got to pick up his old identity and gets to hold his new one high. Later, let's keep going in the passage. It says later, we have a little bit that happens in between, but then later Jesus finds him in the temple and said, "See, you have been made well. Don't sin anymore in case something worse happens to you." The man went and proclaimed to Jewish leaders that Jesus was the man who made him well. Now, I think this is really important to look at because not only does Jesus show up, like this guy had been away, he comes back, or Jesus actually goes and finds him again, but Jesus says this thing that to me, there's kind of two different ways to read this. The first one is it sounds really sinister, right? Like during this time, there would have been a really strong belief that the reason that this man was sick, that the reason this man had this problem wasn't because of like, it was just happened to be like a medical thing that happened. Instead, it would have been more like, oh, hey, you have a sin in your life that you are not confessing, and because of that, that's why you're sick. Or like maybe there was like a sin that your parents had, and like because of their sin, now you are having to pay for it. So that was like a big prevalent thing. So many people, instead of even wanting to give him money, would have just been like, hey, just, ask for forgiveness, stop your life of sin, and then you'll finally be healed again. And so Jesus is maybe being super sinister here, right? Where he says, see, you have been made well. Don't sin anymore in case something worse happens to you. Which like is literally like Marvel evil villain level of like evil, right? Like that just feels like the grossest thing, like kind of slaps you on the back and then walks away. I don't think that's what Jesus is doing here. I think instead what he's more likely doing is actually just making a joke, right? Like I think sometimes when we look at the life of Jesus, it's really easy to kind of just think of him as like, oh, he's just kind of like a dry guy. Like he didn't laugh a lot. He's kind of humorless. He just goes around and kind of just heals people and says really smart things. But I think what really Jesus is doing is just making a joke with him, kind of nudging him like, hey, don't sin anymore in case something worse happens to you, right? Like kind of like that wasn't really the thing the whole time, right? Kind of just nudging him with it. But regardless of what Jesus is doing here, the way that he's joking with this man, what Jesus does is this is now the second time that he meets this man where he's at. He literally, Jesus kind of embodied the incarnation, the thing that we celebrate every Christmas with God with us. Jesus is literally doing that in the most tangible, physical way possible, right? That Jesus is choosing to be near this man. And because of that, his life is completely changed. And so for me, as we're kind of going through this, because remember, we kind of talked about those three different things that a sign points to, a miracle points to. So the first thing that we got to talk about is, what does this point to us about Jesus? What does this tell us about how Jesus is? The first one is simply this: Jesus meets you where you are, right? Like Jesus met this man in his pain. Like he'd been doing this for 38 years. Sometimes I get tired of things after like a week, right? And this guy had been doing this in 38 years. You know how easy it would have been for him to just be like, yes, just over for me. This is just my lot in life. This is just what I'm forever going to do. Instead, Jesus meets him where he is, in his pain. And I'm here to tell you, like, that same thing is true for us. That no matter where you are, no matter what maybe your past looks like, maybe your life, like you had this big, amazing plan for it, and you even followed that big, amazing plan, and then you got to the end of it, and you're like, this isn't at all how I thought this was going to feel. this is so much worse than I thought it was going to be at the end. Or maybe you're on the other side. And maybe you're here and you're like, you know what? Nothing in my plan has ever worked out. Literally, my whole life just feels like it's random things happening to me. Or maybe you're here and like you'd say like, you know what? 2022, literally one of the best years of my life. So far, everything's going really good. You know, family's doing good, work's going good. You know, all these other things. Or maybe you're here and you're like, you know what? I kind of rather go back to 2020, which is a really rough place to be, right? To like say, no, I don't want this year anymore. I'd rather go back. Maybe your year has been that bad. Or maybe you're here and you're just kind of in the middle, right? And it just kind of feels like everything's kind of just like, okay. And it kind of doesn't feel like you're that excited about anything. You kind of just feel numb to so many things. Kind of just feels like, you know what? No matter what, Jesus is going to meet us where we're at. Jesus is going to meet you no matter where you are right now. Jesus is saying, I am with you. So the second thing is, what does this show us about God's kingdom? It's simply this: you have a place. Like, no matter who you are, you have a place. God's kingdom, what God is doing in the world, healing and fixing broken things, redeeming the world, He's saying, hey, you have a place in it. This man's life, I think all of us would say, like, we don't envy. I don't want to live, in that way for 38 years. But all of a sudden, he has this interaction with Jesus, and his life not only is completely changed personally, but on top of that, he goes around then telling other people about how good this life change is. And I'm here to tell you that no matter what your label is, whether it's one that you wanted on yourself or not, maybe it's something that you never even chose for yourself, whatever those labels are that are on your life, Jesus is saying, hey, you have a place in my kingdom. You can belong. I love you. There is still work to do. He's literally like grabbing a shovel going, here, I want you to join in with me on what I am doing. You can be a part of this. You have a place. And I think the last thing I think is so important and kind of goes back to that question that I think for all of us, something that we need to ask ourselves is, do you want to get well? Like, where in your life is that thing that you are stuck? And ask yourself, do you really want to get well? Or do you just kind of want to stay sick and keep doing the same thing that you have been doing over and over because it feels so much easier? You kind of already learned all your coping mechanisms for that. Or are you going to partner with God and join in on the work that He is doing in you so that you can continue to actually be healthy instead of staying sick? And sometimes that might look like, I'm just throwing out some options. Maybe that looks like counseling. Maybe there's that trauma that has literally been holding you back, keeping you sick your whole life. And maybe your first step is, you know what, I'm just going to finally get into counseling. For the record, I think that's one of those things that is less of a stigma now than it ever used to be. But I fully believe that counseling is for everybody. All the time. I think it's just one of those things that is really healthy to help you work through things. So maybe for you, that's the way that you're going to help kind of get yourself from being sick to getting healthy. Maybe that counseling is that first step. Or maybe it's just that hard conversation, right? With that person that as soon as I said that, you were already like, I was hoping he wasn't going to say the hard conversation part, right? Because you already know this was that conversation you should have had months ago, and you've just been letting it drag on. Maybe it's that hard conversation you have to have with that person. Maybe that's where you're going to partner in for the miracle to heal yourself. Or maybe it's as simple as you've just gotten into a rut, right? You've just had this routine that you've done where you go to work, you come home, you take care of the kids, or maybe you do whatever things, you do the chores, and then you just go back to work, right? And it's just repeat over and over, and you've just been stuck in this routine. Maybe for you, you need to break that routine so that you can finally get well and get the help that you need. And can you imagine how much differently life would be if we really believed this and lived it out? What we really see in this miracle, in this sign, is that we have a creator God who loves us. And He doesn't just love us, He likes us, right? And He does it so much that He doesn't just leave us to our own devices, that He is a God that cares for us so much that He doesn't just watch from a distance. Instead, He is a God that comes down to be with us. He is a God that doesn't exclude us from what he's doing. Instead, he includes us in the amazing life change that he is doing all over the world, the life change that he's doing in us and in others. And that he is a God that is literally over the whole world. Like nothing on this planet even gets breath without this God. He's literally running the entire universe, right? But he still knows us so intimately and so personally that he cares about if we are sick, if we are well. He wants to help us with our personal struggles. That God is telling us that our labels that maybe we put on ourselves or other people put on us don't matter to him. To him, the labels that we have is that we are loved, that we matter.